There's a moment in almost every crime story where things quietly fall apart. No sirens, no courtroom drama, just one decision made behind closed doors. Sometimes it's not the police who crack the case. It's someone on the inside, someone who knows exactly where the bodies are buried. Literally. A trusted ally, a family member, a partner who suddenly realizes they're next. These aren't stories about justice arriving on time. They're about loyalty snapping under pressure, and criminals undoing criminals. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. Let's start with the first cases, where the most powerful figures thought they were untouchable, until the wrong person started talking. Dean Corll murders, stopped by the killer who was supposed to help. For years, Dean Corll moved through life without drawing attention. No dramatic crime scenes, no citywide panic, just a growing number of missing boys that never quite lined up until it was already too late. Corll didn't work alone. He surrounded himself with teenagers who trusted him, feared him, and slowly became trapped in his control. One of them was Elmer Wayne Henley. At first, Henley convinced himself he was doing what he had to do to survive. Then he told himself he had no choice at all. That lie only works for so long. By 1973, Henley began to understand something terrifying. Corll wasn't just killing others anymore. He was planning to kill him. In that instant, the power dynamic flipped. Fear turned into urgency. Loyalty evaporated. Survival became immediate. During a heated argument, Corll let his guard down. Henley didn't hesitate. He shot Corll multiple times, killing him on the spot. Just like that, one of the most horrific killing sprees in American history ended. Not through careful police work, but because a killer turned on the man who controlled him. But the most important part came next. Henley didn't run. He didn't hide. He called the police. He confessed. And then he did something investigators never expected. He led them directly to the burial sites. Mass graves, dozens of victims, evidence that would have stayed hidden forever if he hadn't talked. Another accomplice, David Brooks, later admitted his role as well. Together, their cooperation exposed the true scale of Corll's crimes, and finally gave families answers they'd been denied for years. Henley didn't become a hero. He went to prison. So did Brooks. Justice didn't erase the suffering or undo the loss. But without that final betrayal, many victims would still be missing, and Corll might have remained nothing more than a dark rumor whispered among the disappeared. This case forces an uncomfortable truth into the open. Sometimes the only reason evil stops is because even the people helping it decide they've gone too far. And when that happens, the truth doesn't arrive cleanly. It arrives soaked in damage, fear, and consequences that never fully fade. The Hillside Stranglers, when one killer saves himself. The Hillside Strangler case sent fear through Los Angeles in the late 1970s. Women were disappearing, bodies were being discovered in the hills, and as investigators compared notes, one thing became impossible to ignore. This wasn't random. Someone was actively hunting. What made the crimes even more disturbing was the method. The killers didn't rely on brute force alone. Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono Jr. posed as police officers. They used badges, confidence, and authority to disarm their victims. Women didn't resist because they believed they were safe. That illusion of safety made the betrayal almost as horrifying as the murders themselves. Eventually, the investigation narrowed in. Bianchi was arrested, and that's where everything shifted. Staring at the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison, Bianchi faced a decision he'd likely never imagined making: loyalty or survival. In the end, survival won. Rather than protect his cousin, Bianchi named Buono as his accomplice. What followed was one of the most unsettling courtroom sagas in criminal history. Bianchi spent months on the witness stand, describing crimes he had personally taken part in. Sometimes he downplayed his role. Other times his statements conflicted with earlier testimony. The court and the public were left wrestling with an uncomfortable question. Could a man like this be trusted? The answer wasn't simple. Bianchi wasn't fully credible. His testimony was clearly self-serving, but it was detailed, specific, and crucially, it lined up with enough independent evidence to hold weight. Buono never confessed. He denied everything to the end. He showed no remorse and never acknowledged the suffering he caused. But Bianchi's testimony, imperfect and morally compromised, gave prosecutors what they needed to secure a conviction. This wasn't justice in its cleanest form. It was messy, negotiated, built on the words of someone who absolutely did not deserve sympathy. But it achieved one critical thing. It stopped Buono from ever hurting anyone again. Bianchi didn't walk free. He paid for his crimes. But by choosing to talk, he shifted the case from endless terror to final accountability. The Hillside Strangler case leaves behind a deeply unsettling truth. Sometimes, the only way to end extreme evil is to accept help from someone who helped create it. And that reality never sits comfortably, no matter how necessary it may be. Ken and Barbie killers. Love, violence, and a calculated betrayal. From the outside, they looked like the kind of couple people envied. Young, attractive, intelligent, in love. That image made what came next almost impossible to process. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka weren't just criminals operating side by side. They were partners in cruelty. Their relationship wasn't a cover for the crimes. It was part of the engine driving them. Together, they committed some of the most disturbing crimes in Canadian history, while appearing outwardly normal. For a long time, Bernardo seemed untouchable. Evidence was thin, investigations stalled, victims piled up. He slipped through cracks that should never have existed. What finally broke the case wasn't police brilliance or a sudden forensic breakthrough. It was the relationship imploding from the inside. Behind closed doors, the image of love collapsed into violence. Homolka endured repeated abuse, physical, emotional, and psychological. The same control Bernardo used on his victims was turned inward, and eventually, something in Homolka broke. She started talking, first to her family, then quietly, carefully, to a lawyer. What she revealed was devastating. She described Bernardo's crimes in detail, including acts that involved her own sister. That confession alone sent shockwaves through investigators and reopened cases that had gone cold. But words weren't enough. Homolka went further. She helped authorities uncover videotapes, real footage documenting Bernardo's assaults. There was no room for doubt anymore. No deniability. No version of events he could talk his way out of. Those tapes changed everything. Cases were reopened. DNA evidence was re-examined. Patterns that had once seemed disconnected suddenly aligned. A man who had evaded justice for years was finally cornered by proof he couldn't escape. In exchange for her cooperation, Homolka accepted a plea deal, and that's where the controversy exploded. At the time, prosecutors believed she was a lesser participant. She received a sentence of 12 years, but as more evidence emerged, it became clear her role was far more active than originally understood. Public outrage followed. Many felt justice had been traded for convenience. Still, the outcome was undeniable. Bernardo was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Homolka served her time and was released. The debate over whether justice was truly served hasn't ended, and likely never will. This case forces an uncomfortable truth into the open. Sometimes the person who helped stop a monster didn't just witness the evil, they helped build it. And when that truth surfaces, there are no clean endings, only consequences that linger long after the courtroom doors close. The Green River Murders. When a killer helped catch another killer. By the time investigators realized how serious the Green River murders were, the damage was already staggering. Women were vanishing across Washington state, bodies kept appearing, and the killer seemed to move effortlessly, without patterns police could lock onto. Years passed, no arrest. Desperate for insight, investigators turned to an unlikely source. Ted Bundy, a man who understood predators because he was one. Bundy wasn't helping out of kindness. He was already on death row. What he offered was perspective. He described how the Green River killer would think, hunt, and blend into the environment. Someone familiar with the area, someone ordinary, someone patient. Those insights didn't solve the case overnight, but they shifted how investigators looked at suspects. Eventually, DNA evidence led police to Gary Ridgway. For years, he had lived quietly, holding jobs, raising suspicions, but never enough to convict. When the science finally caught up, the case collapsed inward on him. Ridgway confessed to murdering nearly 50 women. Bundy didn't catch him. DNA did. But Bundy's psychological insight helped narrow the field long before technology delivered the final blow. It's unsettling to admit, but sometimes understanding evil requires listening to someone who embodies it. The Snowtown Murders. The accomplice who broke the silence. Australia's Snowtown murders weren't just brutal, they were methodical. Between 1992 and 1999, John Bunting and his group tortured and murdered at least 11 people. Some victims were family members. Others were chosen for reasons that barely made sense. Bodies were hidden in barrels, stored, forgotten, or so they thought. The case unraveled not because of a brilliant raid, but because one accomplice cracked. James Vlasakis decided to talk. And when he did, everything spilled out. He described the planning, the hierarchy, the violence, and most importantly, he exposed Bunting as the unquestioned ringleader. Once police followed the trail, the horror became undeniable. Barrels were recovered, evidence stacked up, Bunting was arrested and convicted. Vlasakis received a reduced sentence for cooperating, a deal that angered many but made the convictions possible. Without his testimony, Snowtown might still be a rumor whispered instead of a case fully exposed. The Winter Hill Gang, betrayed by the system that protected him. For years, Whitey Bulger seemed untouchable, not because he was invisible, but because he was protected. As leader of the Winter Hill Gang, murder was routine. But Bulger had something more powerful than fear, an FBI handler who tipped him off before arrests. That protection allowed him to vanish in 1994, becoming one of America's most wanted fugitives. He stayed hidden for 16 years. When Bulger was finally captured in 2011, the walls closed in fast. Former allies began talking. One by one, they testified about murders carried out under his orders. John Martirano admitted to killing multiple people for Bulger. Others followed. The image of the untouchable boss collapsed under the weight of insider testimony. In 2013, Bulger was convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to life in prison. He would later be killed behind bars, not by rivals but by the same violent world he helped create. His downfall proved something chilling. Even the most protected criminals eventually lose the people willing to protect them. The Lucchese crime family. Survival over silence. There's a rule in the Mafia that matters more than all the others combined. You don't talk. Ever. Breaking that rule doesn't just end your career, it signs your death warrant. That's why what happened inside the Lucchese crime family sent shockwaves through organized crime. It wasn't a loose associate who flipped. It was someone deep enough to understand how deadly the consequences would be. Henry Hill wasn't a made man, but he lived inside the machinery. Drug trafficking, hijackings, extortion. Violence wasn't background noise, it was the job. And by 1980, that job was about to kill him. Hill was arrested on drug charges. That alone wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what was happening around him. Associates were disappearing, executed, cleaned out, one by one. Hill realized the truth before anyone said it out loud. He wasn't going to prison. He was being erased. So he made the choice the Mafia teaches you never to make. He cooperated. Hill testified against powerful figures like Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke, laying out the inner workings of the organization. Not just names, but systems. How crimes were planned, how money flowed, how murders were ordered without being spoken out loud. It wasn't bravery, it was survival. Hill entered witness protection and lived the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. The code was broken, but the fear never disappeared. His testimony weakened the Lucchese family permanently. It didn't destroy the Mafia, but it proved something dangerous. Silence was no longer guaranteed. And once that myth died, organized crime was never the same again. Frank Calabrese Sr., destroyed by his own blood. If betrayal hurts most when it comes from family, this case is almost unbearable. Frank Calabrese Sr. built his reputation on violence. Fear was how he ruled, on the street and at home. His relationship with his son, Frank Calabrese Jr., was abusive, controlling, and volatile. No trust, no warmth, just power. While serving time in prison, Calabrese Jr. made a decision that took years to fully calculate. He began secretly writing letters to the FBI, carefully, quietly. Each letter detailed his father's crimes and his willingness to cooperate. This became the foundation of Operation Family Secrets, one of the most devastating blows to the Chicago outfit in history. Wearing a wire, Calabrese Jr. recorded his father bragging about murders. Cold, casual, unrepentant. Those recordings didn't just implicate one man. They reopened decades-old cases from the 1970s and 1980s. And the betrayal didn't stop there. Calabrese Sr.'s own brother also testified against him. Dozens of mob figures were indicted. Murders that had gone unsolved for generations finally had names attached to them. Calabrese Sr. was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. There was no dramatic courtroom collapse, no apology, just a man realizing the control he enforced through terror had finally failed. This wasn't justice delivered by strangers. It was justice delivered by the people he believed would never turn on him. John Gotti, when the Teflon Don finally stuck. For years and years, John Gotti seemed immune to consequences. Charges came and went. Witnesses disappeared. Cases collapsed. The media crowned him the Teflon Don. Nothing would stick. And Gotti leaned into it, projecting confidence, dominance, inevitability. But the thing about power is this: it only works while people believe in it. Behind the scenes, Gotti was talking too much, blaming others, rewriting history. And the person listening most closely was his own underboss, Salvatore Gravano. Gravano wasn't a minor figure. He was a high-ranking hitman, deeply involved in murders ordered by Gotti himself. Loyalty ran deep, until it didn't. When Gravano heard FBI wiretaps of Gotti shifting blame onto him, something snapped. The illusion of brotherhood shattered. Gotti wasn't protecting his crew, he was positioning scapegoats. So Gravano flipped. He didn't just confirm what authorities suspected, he filled in every missing detail. Who ordered what? Who pulled triggers? How they stayed ahead of law enforcement for years. That testimony changed everything. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life without parole. The untouchable boss died behind prison walls in 2002. The Mafia didn't fall that day, but the myth did. And once fear stops working, power follows it into the grave. The murder of Whitey Bulger, when jailhouse informants decide a life. Some cases don't collapse because of betrayal, they unravel because of uncertainty. And few cases show that better than the murder of Whitey Bulger. In 1985, Bulger was brutally murdered. The crime shocked investigators, and pressure to find answers mounted fast. Eventually, two men were convicted, James Daly and Jack Percy. Percy received a life sentence. Daly was sent to death row. But here's where the case becomes deeply unsettling. There was no physical evidence tying Daly directly to the murder. No DNA, no weapon, no eyewitness placing him at the scene. The case against him rested almost entirely on testimony from jailhouse informants, men who claimed Daly confessed to them while behind bars. One of those informants, Paul Skalnick, became central to the prosecution. He provided graphic details that prosecutors argued only the killer could know. But jailhouse informants come with a problem no court can fully erase: incentive, reduced sentences, better conditions, favor with prosecutors. These deals create motivation to say whatever helps the state's case, and that shadow never goes away. To complicate things further, Percy himself made inconsistent statements. At times, he claimed Daly committed the murder. Other times, he implied he acted alone. His story shifted depending on when and where he was talking. Years passed, appeals were filed, doubts grew. Daly has always maintained his innocence. He never testified at trial. He never confessed in court. Yet courts repeatedly ruled that the informant testimony was sufficient. Supporters argue the case represents everything that can go wrong in the justice system: reliance on incentivized witnesses, lack of physical proof, and the irreversible weight of a death sentence. Opponents argue the jury heard the evidence and made its decision, and that's what makes this case so disturbing. There is no clean villain reveal, no dramatic confession that settles everything, just a man sitting on death row for decades, insisting the system got it wrong, and a murder victim whose true story may never be fully known. This isn't a story about criminals betraying criminals. It's about how fragile truth can become when freedom, or death, hangs in the balance. And once a verdict is reached, uncertainty doesn't stop the clock. Every case you heard today ended because someone talked. Sometimes it was fear, sometimes survival, sometimes revenge. But the real question is this: did talking always bring justice, or just an ending? Which case disturbed you the most, and why? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If these deep dives into real crime keep you hooked, like the video, share it with someone who loves true stories, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because the most dangerous secrets are the ones someone eventually decides to tell.